It started on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I had volunteered to help clear out my grandparents' old attic, a dusty, cluttered space that hadn't been touched in years. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and mothballs, and cobwebs clung to every corner. Most of the boxes were filled with mundane things: old photo albums, outdated magazines, and forgotten holiday decorations. But as I sifted through one particularly heavy box marked miscellaneous, my hand brushed against something unexpected. A VHS tape. It was unlabeled, its black casing worn and scratched, as if it had been handled far too many times. It felt out of place among the books and trinkets. I held it up to the dim light filtering through the attic window, turning it over in my hands. The tape had no markings, no title, no clues as to what contained. Just an old, silent relic from a time when VHS was king. Strange, I muttered, setting it aside. I asked my grandmother about it later that day, but she just shook her head. "Couldn't tell you," she said, frowning. "We haven't had a VHS player in decades. Must have been left here by the previous owners." The answer didn't satisfy me. If anything, it made the tape more intriguing. Who leaves behind a single, unlabeled tape, and why? I showed it to my friend Nate later that evening. He had come over to keep me company while I sorted through the attic finds. Nate was the type of person who loved conspiracy theories and urban legends, so I knew he'd get a kick out of it. "Careful with stuff like that," he said with a grin. "You ever hear about cursed tapes? You watch them, and something bad happens. Classic horror movie stuff, like The Ring." I joked, laughing it off. This is probably just an old home movie or something. Still, his words lingered in the back of my mind as I placed the tape on the coffee table in the living room. My curiosity battled with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake. That night, after Nate had gone home, I found myself staring at the tape. The house was quiet, save for the rain pattering against the windows. "Just watch it," I told myself. "It's probably nothing." I dug out an old VHS player from the basement, one of the many relics my grandparents had never gotten rid of. After fiddling with the wires and dusting it off, I finally got it connected to the TV. The screen flickered to life with a faint hum, and I slid the tape into the player. The whirring sound of the tape winding sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. For a moment, the screen stayed black, and I thought the tape might be blank. But then a grainy image appeared. The footage was shaky, the colors washed out, as though it had been recorded on a very old camera. It showed an empty room, plain walls, a wooden floor, and a single chair placed in the center. The room was lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, distorted shadows. I leaned forward, frowning. There was no sound, no movement. Just the chair, sitting there in eerie stillness. Minutes passed, and nothing changed. I started to think it really was just some kind of meaningless home video. But just as I reached for the remote to turn it off, something caught my eye. The shadows in the corner of the room moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but they shifted in a way that wasn't natural. It was as if the shadows were alive, crawling along the walls like living things. I froze, my hand hovering over the remote. The shadows continued to move, coalescing into shapes that almost resembled human figures. But before I could make sense of it, the screen went black again. For a moment, I sat there in silence, my heart pounding. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the screen flickered back on. This time, the chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, slumped forward, its face obscured by shadows. Its body was unnaturally still, almost like a mannequin, and its hands rested limply on its lap. The uneasy feeling in my chest deepened. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me. And then, as if confirming my fears, the figure's head tilted slightly. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. The screen went black again, and this time it stayed that way. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the static-filled screen. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I couldn't explain why. "Just an old video," I told myself, ejecting the tape. But my hands were shaking as I placed it back on the coffee table. I decided not to watch it again that night. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be seen. As I turned off the TV and headed upstairs, I couldn't shake the image of the figure on the chair. It lingered in my mind, a dark, oppressive presence that refused to leave. And in the silence of my bedroom, as I tried to fall asleep, I I could have sworn I heard a faint sound, the soft whirring of a VHS tape being rewound. I couldn't stop thinking about the tape. The figure in the chair, the unnatural movements of the shadows. It was all burned into my mind. By the time morning came, I had convinced myself that it was just some bizarre coincidence, maybe even a prank recorded years ago. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease it left behind. By early evening, my curiosity had worn out. The house was quiet, the day's light fading into the cool hues of twilight. I found myself back in the living room, staring at the VHS tape sitting on the coffee table. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself as I slid the tape back into the player. I needed to see it again to convince myself that it wasn't as sinister as I remembered. The screen flickered to life once more, and there it was, the same grainy image of the empty room. The chair sat in the center, bathed in the pale, flickering light of the overhead bulb. I leaned forward, my eyes glued to the screen. The shadows in the corners seemed still this time, but that didn't make the room feel any less oppressive. There was something about it, something intangible, that made my chest tighten. Minutes passed, and I began to wonder if anything would happen. I told myself to relax, to breathe, but my body felt tense, my fingers gripping the edge of the couch. And then, just as before, the shadows began to move. This time, it wasn't subtle. The darkness stretched unnaturally along the walls, curling and twisting like smoke. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, as though the shadows were aware of the space they inhabited. The chair remained empty, but the shadows seemed to gather around it, circling like predators around prey. I felt a chill run down my spine as a faint sound began to emerge from the tape. At first, it was just a low hum, almost like static, but it grew louder, forming into what sounded like whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, insistent, and undeniably human. I turned up the volume, straining to hear, but the whispers remained maddeningly unclear. They overlapped, voices rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. And then the screen flickered. When the image returned, the chair was no longer empty. The figure was back, slumped forward as before, its face hidden in shadow. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting into something urgent, almost pleading. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, waiting for something to happen. The figure didn't move, but the longer I looked at it, the more it felt like it was aware of me. "Come on," I whispered to myself, my voice shaky. "Do something." As if in response, the figure slowly lifted its head. Its face was still obscured by the shadows. I could see the faint outline of its features, a hollowed mouth, darkened eyes, and skin that looked almost too smooth, too artificial. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural hum. The figure leaned forward slightly, and for a split second, I thought I saw it reach toward the camera. And then the screen went black. I sat there in stunned silence, my heart racing. The tape didn't eject itself this time. It stayed in the player, the faint hum of the machine the only sound in the room. I reached for the remote, but before I could turn off the TV, the image returned. This time, the camera angle had changed. It was no longer focused on the chair. It was focused on the door to the room. My breath caught as I watched the door slowly creak open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The camera remained fixed on the open doorway, the silence deafening. My eyes darted across the screen, searching for movement, but there was nothing. And then, faintly, a shadow began to form in the doorway. It wasn't like the shadows I'd seen before. This one was darker, denser, almost tangible. It moved slowly, stepping into the room with an unnatural grace. I wanted to look away, to turn off the tape, but I couldn't. Something about it held me captive. The shadow moved toward the chair, its form becoming more distinct. It wasn't fully human, it was elongated, with limbs that seemed too long and movements that were unnervingly fluid. It stopped in front of the chair, standing perfectly still. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it turned to face the camera. I felt my stomach drop as I realized it wasn't just looking at the camera, it was looking at me. The screen flickered again, and the image cut out. This time, the tape did eject itself, the machine whirring softly as it spat the cassette onto the coffee table. I stared at it, my hands trembling. My reflection in the darkened screen of the TV looked pale and shaken. I told myself it was just a recording, just an old, strange tape with creepy footage. But the feeling in my chest, the oppressive weight, the sense of being watched, told me otherwise. The tape wasn't just something to be seen. It was something alive. I turned off the TV, trying to shake the lingering unease. But as I headed upstairs to my bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The whispers from the tape seemed to echo faintly in the back of my mind, growing louder as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. And just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, the soft whirring sound of a tape being rewound, coming from the living room below. The next morning, I woke with a heavy sense of unease. I'd barely slept, my mind replaying the unsettling images from the tape. The whispers, the figure, the way it seemed to look at me through the screen. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I went downstairs, half expecting the tape to be gone, but there it was, sitting on the coffee table exactly where I had left it. Its presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong in my house. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an old recording, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through my day, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small. I'd catch faint movements in the corner of my eye, like shadows shifting where there shouldn't be any. The whispers, too, returned. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there, faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. By the afternoon, the feeling of unease had grown stronger. Every room in the house felt off, as though I wasn't alone. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself it was all in my head. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. One of the chairs at the table had been pulled out, facing away from the table as if someone had been sitting there. I knew I hadn't touched it, and I lived alone. My heart raced as I approached the chair, half expecting to see someone sitting there. But it was empty. I pushed it back under the table, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the day turned to evening, the unease only grew. The shadows in the house felt darker, more oppressive, and the whispers became more distinct. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but no matter what channel I switched to, I couldn't focus. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, felt like it was tied to the tape. Eventually, I gave up and turned the TV off. The silence that followed was deafening. And then I heard it, the soft whirring sound of a VHS tape being rewound. The sound came from the living room, even though I knew the tape wasn't in the player. My breath caught as I walked to the doorway, peering into the room. The tape was still on the coffee table, exactly where I had left it. But the whirring sound continued, growing louder as I stepped closer. I picked up the tape, my hands trembling. The sound stopped the moment I touched it, the room falling into an eerie silence. Just a tape, I whispered to myself. It's just a tape. But as I held it, I felt a strange chill run through my fingers, like the tape was alive. I set it back down quickly, trying to ignore the creeping dread in my chest. The night passed slowly, every creak of the house setting me on edge. The whispers didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The chair in the living room, the one I had been sitting in while watching the tape, was now facing the TV. I hadn't moved it. Worse, the VHS player was on, the screen showing static as though the tape had been playing all night. I knew I hadn't turned it on. I ejected the tape, checking the time counter. It was rewound to the beginning, but I knew I hadn't done that either. The machine shouldn't have even been plugged in. I had unplugged it the night before. I stared at the blank screen, my chest tightening. Something from the tape was seeping into my home, into my life. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. It wasn't just fear. It was a strange sense of obligation, like the tape had chosen me for a reason. The shadows in the house became more pronounced in the following days. They moved when they shouldn't have, stretching and shifting in ways that defied logic. I started seeing faint impressions in the mirrors, shapes that didn't belong. They weren't clear enough to make out, but they were there, just at the edge of visibility. The whispers grew louder at night, forming fragmented sentences that I couldn't fully understand. What? Find it. Don't stop. One night, as I lay in bed, I woke suddenly to the feeling of someone standing over me. My room was dark, but I could feel the weight of a presence, something cold and heavy pressing against the air. I turned on the light, my heart racing, but the room was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but when I looked toward the door, I saw it, a faint shadow darker than the others, lingering just beyond the threshold. The shadow didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. I sat frozen in bed, watching it until the first light of dawn finally chased it away. The next day, I decided to confront the tape head-on. It wasn't just a recording, it was a gateway, and something was coming through. I needed to understand what was happening before it consumed me completely. The tape had taken over my life. The whispers, the shadows, the unshakable sense of being watched. It was all connected to that cursed recording. I couldn't escape its grip, but I could try to understand it. That morning, with the faint echo of whispers still lingering in my ears, I sat down at my computer. I needed answers. Where had the tape come from? Why did it feel so alive? And most importantly, what did it want? I started with the obvious, searching for any mentions of unlabeled VHS tapes tied to strange or paranormal occurrences. At first, my results were filled with conspiracy theories, urban legends, and horror stories posted by anonymous users. But as I sifted through the noise, one thread caught my attention. It was titled "The Hidden Tape, A Gateway to the Unknown." The post was from a user named Spectral Seeker, who claimed to have encountered a tape similar to mine. The description was eerily familiar: an unlabeled VHS, grainy footage of an empty room, and an overwhelming sense of dread. According to the user, the tape was part of a collection created by an enigmatic filmmaker named Henry Braith, an underground artist from the late 1980s who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Braith was rumored to have been obsessed with the concept of capturing the essence of fear on film. His works were described as experimental and deeply unsettling, often featuring static shots, distorted audio, and cryptic imagery. The post claimed that only a handful of Braith's tapes existed and that they were said to be cursed, drawing viewers into their world and leaving them changed forever. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the final lines of the post. If you found one of Braith's tapes, be warned, it's not just a movie. It's a doorway. Once you've watched it, you can't undo what you've started. The only way out is to finish what he began. The user hadn't elaborated on what it meant to finish Braith's work, but the implication was clear: these tapes weren't just recordings. They were alive in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. I spent the next few hours diving deeper into Braith's life. Information was sparse, but I managed to uncover a few fragmented details. Braith had been an independent filmmaker operating on the fringes of the art world. His work never gained mainstream attention, but those who saw his films described them as visceral and disturbing. One article from an old film magazine mentioned a short film he had submitted to an underground festival. The description matched the footage I'd seen on the tape: an empty room, shifting shadows, and a single chair. The article ended with a chilling anecdote. The festival had allegedly canceled Braith's screening after multiple attendees claimed to feel ill just watching the trailer. Soon after, Braith vanished, leaving behind nothing but rumors and his unfinished collection of tapes. The deeper I dug, the more sinister the story became. One forum user claimed that Braith's obsession with fear wasn't just artistic, it was spiritual. According to legend, Braith believed that fear was a form of energy, something that could be harnessed and trapped. His tapes weren't just films, they were vessels, designed to capture and amplify the viewer's deepest fears. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing. If that was true, then the tape in my living room wasn't just haunted, it was feeding on me. I remembered the whispers I'd heard while watching the footage, the way they seemed to grow louder the longer I stared at the screen. It wasn't just trying to scare me, it was drawing something out of me. And the shadows? They weren't random. They were part of whatever lived inside the tape, something that was growing stronger the more I engaged with it. Desperate for more information, I returned to the forum thread. Buried in the comments was a reply from Spectral Seeker, offering a warning to anyone dealing with one of Braith's tapes. Do not destroy it. The tape is indestructible, and trying to break it will only make things worse. The only way to escape is to confront what's inside. The comment ended with a cryptic suggestion. The tape wants you to see something. If you resist, it will haunt you. But if you keep watching, you might find a way to stop it. The idea of watching the tape again filled me with dread, but I couldn't ignore the truth. The more I tried to avoid it, the stronger its presence became. I had to confront it. I glanced at the tape sitting on the coffee table, its black casing almost daring me to pick it up. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the weight of its presence sending a shiver through me. I slid it back into the VHS player, my breath shallow as the screen flickered to life. The room on the screen was the same, but something about it felt different this time. The shadows were darker, the light dimmer, and the chair seemed to be waiting for me. The whispers returned, louder than ever, forming fragmented phrases that sent chills down my spine. Keep watching. Find the truth. Finish it. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. The room felt alive, its presence seeping through the screen and into my living room. And then the camera moved. It was subtle at first, a slight tilt, a slow zoom toward the chair. But it felt deliberate, like someone or something was behind the camera, guiding it. The chair wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there, slumped forward, its form barely visible in the flickering light. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic hum as the figure slowly lifted its head. I leaned closer, my heart pounding as the camera zoomed in further. The figure's face came into focus, and I froze. It was my face staring back at me. The screen flickered, and the image dissolved into static. The room was silent, but my thoughts raced as I stared at the static-filled screen. My face, that figure, slumped in a chair, had been me. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was some kind of trick or coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. The tape wasn't just feeding on my fear. It was tying itself to me, warping reality in ways I couldn't understand. I ejected the tape, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. It felt heavier than before, as though it carried the weight of the things it had shown me. That night, the whispers returned with a vengeance. They weren't just faint murmurs in the background anymore. They were loud, insistent, and unmistakably directed at me. Watch again. Find the truth. Finish it. I covered my ears, but it was useless. The whispers weren't coming from the house. They were in my head. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, creeping toward me like liquid darkness. I turned on every light I could, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the room from the tape, standing before the chair. Sometimes the figure in the chair was me. Other times it was empty, but I could feel something standing behind me, just out of sight. When I woke, the whispers were still there, softer now, but no less insistent. The tape sat on the coffee table, untouched but radiating an oppressive presence that made it impossible to ignore. I decided to move it to put it somewhere out of sight. I locked it in a drawer in the farthest room of the house, thinking that would at least give me some peace. But it didn't. That night, the shadows grew darker, the whispers louder. I woke to the sound of static, faint but unmistakable, coming from the living room. My stomach churned as I stepped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The static grew louder as I approached, and when I reached the living room, I froze. The tape was back on the coffee table, the TV on and flickering with static. The VHS player wasn't even plugged in. I stared at the tape, my mind racing. How had it gotten there? I knew I hadn't moved it, and I lived alone. The whispers filled the room, their overlapping voices forming a single, clear message. Play it. I wanted to run, to throw the tape out and never look at it again, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The tape wouldn't let me go, and I couldn't escape it. My hands trembled as I slid it back into the player. The screen flickered to life, and the room from the tape appeared once more. This time, the camera angle was different. It wasn't focused on the chair anymore. It was focused on the doorway. The shadows beyond the door were thicker, almost tangible, and I could see faint shapes moving within them. The whispers on the tape grew louder, forming fragmented phrases that made my skin crawl. Come closer. Find the truth. Finish it. The camera zoomed in on the doorway, the shapes in the shadows becoming clearer. I leaned forward, unable to look away, as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same shadowy form I had seen before, elongated, unnatural, and impossibly fluid. It moved toward the chair, its movements deliberate and haunting. The whispers fell silent as the figure sat down, its hollow eyes staring directly into the camera. And then it spoke. Why do you resist? The voice was low and distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. My blood ran cold as the figure tilted its head, its gaze unwavering. You brought me here, it said. You must finish it. The screen flickered, and the figure disappeared. The room on the tape was empty again, but I could feel its presence lingering. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They weren't just coming from the tape anymore. They were all around me, filling the room with a deafening hum. I turned off the TV and ejected the tape, But the whispers didn't stop. The shadows in the room stretched toward me, their movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The house no longer felt like my own. The tape had changed something. It wasn't just a recording, it was a doorway, and something had come through. I tried to escape it, leaving the house for hours at a time, but the feeling of being followed never left. The shadows stretched longer, the whispers grew louder, and the tape refused to be ignored. When I returned home one evening, I found the tape already in the player, the TV on and flickering with static. It was waiting for me. The only way forward was to confront it. I knew that now. The tape wasn't going to let me go until I did what it wanted. I sat down in front of the TV, my hands trembling as I pressed play. The room on the tape appeared once more, but this time it wasn't empty. The figure was back, sitting in the chair, its hollow eyes locked onto the camera. "Finish it," it said. The screen flickered, and I felt the room around me grow colder. I wasn't just watching the tape anymore. I was becoming a part of it. The figure's words echoed in my head long after the screen went black. "Finish it." I sat frozen, the static humming from the TV filling the room like white noise in a nightmare. The realization was creeping over me, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't just a random tape. It was connected to me, somehow, and I needed to understand why. The whispers, the shadows, the chair, all of it felt deliberate. The figure wasn't just trying to scare me. It wanted something tied to the tape and to me. I decided to dig deeper into my past. There had to be a reason this tape had found its way to me. The attic where I discovered it wasn't just filled with junk. It was a collection of my family's forgotten history. I started by asking my grandmother about Henry Braith, the name I'd found linked to the tape in my research. Her reaction was instant, a sharp intake of breath, her face going pale. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, her voice trembling. I explained everything, finding the tape, the strange footage, and the horrifying things that had been happening since I watched it. Her expression darkened with every word, and when I finished, she was silent for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "There are things in our family's past that were never meant to be uncovered," she said. Henry Braith was one of them. She went on to explain that Braith had been a distant relative, a man whose name was rarely spoken of because of the darkness that surrounded him. He was different, she said, choosing her words carefully. Obsessed with his work. But his work wasn't normal. He believed he could capture things on film that weren't meant to be seen, things from beyond our world. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He experimented with fear, with energy, with souls. He thought the camera could act as a bridge, a way to hold on to things that should have been let go. The mention of souls made my skin crawl. I asked her what had happened to him, but she hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "He disappeared," she said finally, "after his last film. Some say he went mad, others say worse things." Her eyes met mine, filled with fear. But his work didn't disappear with him. It's cursed, all of it. People who come into contact with it, they don't stay the same. I told her about the figure in the tape, the shadows, and the whispers. Her face went ashen. "You have to stop watching it," she said urgently. "Whatever he was trying to capture, it's not human. And it's using you to finish what he started." Her words sent a chill through me. I asked her why it had chosen me, but she didn't have an answer. "Maybe it's because you're family," she said. "Or maybe it's because you found it. Either way, it won't stop until it gets what it wants." I left her house with more questions than answers. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the tape on the coffee table. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind, but so did the figure's words. "Finish it." The whispers started again, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just random words anymore. They were sentences, phrases that felt personal, directed at me. "You're the key. Complete what was left unfinished. Set it free." I didn't understand what it meant to finish the tape, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just about watching. It was about confronting whatever was inside it. I pressed play again, my heart pounding as the screen flickered to life. This time, the footage was different. The camera was no longer in the room. It was moving through a dark hallway, its lens focusing on a series of framed photographs hanging on the walls. The photos were old, faded, but one of them made my blood run cold. It was a picture of my grandmother as a child, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. The whispers grew louder as the camera lingered on the photo. "He's waiting," they said. "Find him." The camera moved on, its lens focusing on a door at the end of the hallway. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the familiar room with the chair in the center. But this time, the figure wasn't slumped in the chair. It was standing, facing the camera. The figure pointed directly at me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "You know where to go," it said. The screen went black, and the tape ejected itself. I sat there, my hands trembling as I processed what I had just seen. The hallway, the photographs, the door. It wasn't just random footage. It was a place, a real place, and the tape was showing me how to find it. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the attic, the whispers guiding me as I sifted through old boxes. Finally, I found what I was looking for, a stack of old photographs, including the one I had seen on the tape. On the back of the photo was an address. My stomach churned as I read it. It was a house on the outskirts of town, one I had never been to before. The whispers grew louder, urging me forward, find him. I didn't sleep that night. The tape had made it clear, whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until I followed its instructions. As dawn broke, I made up my mind. I was going to the house. The address on the back of the photograph led me to a part of town I'd never ventured into before. The house was old, isolated, and shrouded in an eerie stillness that seemed to repel the rest of the world. The overgrown yard and peeling paint gave it an abandoned look, but as I stood at the gate, I could feel the same oppressive energy that radiated from the tape. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling my ears with fragmented commands. "Go inside. He's waiting. Finish it." I gripped the photograph tightly in my hand, the image of my grandmother and the strange man staring back at me. The man in the photo had the same hollow eyes as the figure in the tape. Pushing open the creaking gate, I stepped onto the cracked walkway leading to the front door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave and never return, but I couldn't. The tape wouldn't let me. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a low groan as I pushed against it. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. The whispers became more distinct as I stepped into the dark hallway. They weren't just voices, they were breaths, soft and rhythmic, as though the house itself was alive. The hallway was almost identical to the one in the tape. The same faded wallpaper, the same creaking floorboards, and the same row of framed photographs lining the walls. I shined my flashlight over the pictures, my heart pounding as I recognized faces from my family tree. My grandmother as a child, her parents, and even older relatives I'd only ever seen in family albums. And then there was him. The man from the tape, from the photograph, the man who had been standing beside my grandmother. His hollow eyes seemed to follow me as I moved down the hallway, his face frozen in an expression that was neither a smile nor a scowl. The whispers grew louder as I approached the end of the hallway. The door from the tape stood before me, slightly ajar, its surface scratched and worn. I hesitated, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the oppressive energy pressing down on my chest. "You have to go inside," the whispers urged. "He's waiting for you." I pushed the door open, my flashlight casting its beam into the room beyond. It was exactly as I had seen it on the tape. Plain walls, a single chair in the center, and a flickering bulb overhead. But the room wasn't empty. The figure stood in the corner, its back to me. Its body was unnaturally tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were listening. The whispers fell silent as I stepped inside, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the figure itself. "Why have you come?" it said, its voice low and distorted, echoing off the walls. I froze, a flashlight trembling in my hand. "You brought me here," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned slowly, its movements unervingly fluid, like smoke solidifying into a shape. Its face was obscured, the shadows clinging to it like a mask, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. "You carry the burden," it said, stepping closer. "You are the key." My chest tightened as it stopped inches from the chair, its hand resting on the backrest. "Why me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You know the answer," it said. "You've always known." The chair creaked as it gestured toward it. "Sit," it commanded, its voice resonating with an unnatural authority. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The whispers returned, softer now, but no less insistent. "Finish it. Set him free." I stepped forward reluctantly, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with every step, the room shrinking around me as though it were collapsing into itself. When I reached the chair, I hesitated, my hand hovering over its worn surface. The figure loomed behind me, its presence overwhelming. "You must complete the cycle," it said. "Finish what was left undone." I turned to face it, my fear boiling over into anger. "What does that mean?" I shouted. "Why me? Why now?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an impossibly long arm, pointing toward the ceiling. The light bulb flickered violently, and the room shifted. The walls melted into darkness, and I was no longer standing in a house. I was back in the room from the tape. The chair was still there, but now it was surrounded by figures, shadowy, indistinct forms that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. The figures stepped closer, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "This is where it began," it said, "and this is where it will end." The figures surrounding the chair began to move, their forms stretching and distorting as they reached toward me. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the darkness closed in. "Finish it," the figure repeated, its voice echoing through the void. My hands shook as I realized what it wanted. The chair wasn't just a prop, it was part of the ritual, the final piece in a puzzle I didn't fully understand. I had to make a choice: confront the entity and risk losing myself, or leave and let the curse continue. The whispers softened, becoming a single voice, clear and distinct. "You can end this. You can set us free." I stumbled back from the chair, my breath shallow and my mind racing. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. The figures surrounding the chair remained motionless, their shadowy forms flickering faintly in the dim light. The entity stood behind a chair, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice low and resonant. The cycle must be completed, but I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. I turned and ran, my flashlight beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long, but I didn't stop. The whispers returned, growing louder with each step I took, their words overlapping into a chaotic chorus. "You cannot escape. Finish it. Destroy it." When I finally reached the front door, I threw it open and stumbled into the night. The cold air hit me like a shock, and I gasped, the weight of the house's presence lifting slightly as I put distance between myself and its dark influence. I drove home in silence, the tape clutched tightly in my hands. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. The entity had said the cycle couldn't be broken, but I refused to believe it. The tape was the source of everything, the whispers, the shadows, the horrifying connection to my family. If I could destroy it, maybe I could end all of this for good. The moment I stepped into my house, I set the tape on the kitchen counter and grabbed a hammer. My hands trembled as I raised it, the weight of the tool almost as heavy as the oppressive presence of the tape itself. I brought the hammer down with all my strength. The tape didn't break. The hammer bounced off the casing, the impact sending a jolt through my hands. I stared at the tape in disbelief. There wasn't even a scratch on its surface. I tried again, swinging harder this time, but the result was the same. The tape was indestructible. The whispers returned, soft and mocking. "You cannot destroy it. It's too late. Finish it." Panic set in as I searched for another way to destroy it. I grabbed a pair of scissors and tried cutting the magnetic tape inside, but the blade snapped in my hands. I tried setting it on fire, but the flames wouldn't catch, the tape remaining cold and untouched. Every attempt ended the same way, and with each failure, the whispers grew louder, their tone more insistent. "Stop resisting. You know what must be done. Finish it." I collapsed onto the floor, the tape lying untouched beside me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as the weight of my failure sank in. The tape wasn't just indestructible. It was alive, feeding on my fear and frustration. Destroying it wasn't an option. The shadows in the room grew darker, stretching toward me like liquid tendrils. I felt the oppressive presence of the entity creeping closer, even though I couldn't see it. "You cannot run," the whispers said. "You cannot destroy it." You must finish it. For a moment, I considered giving up, letting the tape take me, letting the cycle continue. But then I thought about my family, about the man in the photograph, and about the lives this tape had already consumed. If I couldn't destroy it, I had to find another way to break it whole. I picked up the tape and stared at it, my reflection distorted in its glossy surface. The entity's words echoed in my mind. The cycle must be completed. But what if completing the cycle didn't mean surrendering to it? What if it meant confronting it, taking control instead of letting it control me? The whispers softened, as though they were waiting for my decision. The shadows stopped moving, hovering just at the edge of the light. I knew what I had to do. I placed the tape back into the player, my hand steady despite the fear coursing through me. The screen flickered to life, and the room appeared once more. The chair sat empty, the flickering bulb casting long shadows across the walls. This time, I wasn't just watching. I was stepping into the tape's world on my terms. The camera moved, panning slowly toward the doorway. The figure stood there, its form blending with the shadows as it stepped into the room. "You've returned," it said, its voice low and resonant. "You understand now." I stood my ground, refusing to let the fear consume me. "I'm here to end this," I said, my voice firm. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "You cannot end it," it said, "but you can take your place." The whispers rose into a deafening cacophony as the figure pointed toward the chair. "Sit," it commanded. "Finish the art. Complete the cycle." I didn't move. Instead, I stepped closer to the figure, the oppressive energy pressing down on me with every step. "No," I said, my voice steady. "The cycle ends with me. I won't let it continue." The figure's form rippled, its edges blurring as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said. But I didn't believe it. The whispers grew chaotic, overlapping into a single desperate plea. "Finish it. Free us. End it." I realized then that the figure wasn't just an entity. It was a part of the curse, a manifestation of the cycle itself. It wasn't in control. It was trapped, just like everyone else who had encountered the tape. If I could confront it, break its hold, maybe I could free them all. The figure loomed before me, its hollow eyes piercing into my very core. Its form shifted and blurred, as though it were struggling to remain solid. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their chaotic voices filling the air around me. "Finish it. Free us. End the cycle." I clenched my fists, my fear replaced by a growing determination. The figure wasn't invincible. It was desperate. The tape's power wasn't infinite. It thrived on fear, on submission. I wouldn't give it what it wanted. "You're not in control," I said, my voice steady despite the suffocating energy pressing down on me. "You're just as trapped as the others." The figure tilted its head, its form rippling like smoke. "You do not understand," it said, its voice low and resonant. "The cycle cannot be broken. It must be completed. That is the only way." "Why?" I demanded. "Why does this tape exist? Why does it need me?" The figure hesitated, its hollow eyes flickering faintly. "This tape is a vessel," it said finally. "It was created to hold something beyond your understanding, something that cannot exist in your world without a tether. The art was the tether, and the cycle keeps it alive." I stared at the figure, my mind racing. Henry Braith's obsession with capturing fear, his belief in the power of the camera to trap souls, it all made sense now. The tape wasn't just a recording. It was a prison. "And what happens if the cycle ends?" I asked. The figure's form wavered, its voice softening. "The cycle must not end," it said. "To end it is to destroy everything within it, including me, including them." It gestured toward the shadows surrounding the room. As I watched, the shadows shifted, forming into vague humanoid shapes. They weren't just manifestations, they were people. My breath caught as I recognized some of the faces. My grandmother as a child, the man from the photograph, and others I didn't know but who felt connected to me somehow. "They are trapped here," the figure said, "bound to the cycle. If you break it, they will be free. But so will I." Its words sent a chill down my spine. The figure wasn't just part of the curse. It was the entity Braith had trapped within the tape, the thing that had fed on fear and souls for generations. "You want me to finish the cycle so you can keep feeding," I said, anger rising in my voice. "But I'm not going to let that happen." The figure stepped closer, its form towering over me. "You cannot stop it," it said. "You are part of it now. Your fear, your essence, it sustains me. If you resist, you will join them." The shadows crept closer, their forms flickering like dying flames. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a single plea. "Finish it. End it. Set us free." I realized then that the figure wasn't lying. If I broke the cycle, everything in the tape would be destroyed, including the souls trapped within it. But letting the cycle continue would mean feeding the curse, letting it claim more lives, more souls. I turned to the chair, my mind racing. The chair wasn't just a symbol, it was part of the ritual, the center of the curse. To break it, I would have to confront the entity directly, inside its own domain. I stepped toward the chair, the whispers growing louder with every step. The figure's form rippled violently, its voice rising into a distorted roar. "You cannot defeat me," it said. "You will only destroy yourself." "Maybe," I said, sitting down in the chair. "But I'll take you with me." The moment I sat down, the room dissolved into darkness. The air around me grew colder, heavier, and I felt a strange pull, like I was being drawn into the tape itself. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deafening hum that seemed to come from within my own mind. And then I was no longer in the room. I stood in an empty void, the darkness stretching endlessly in all directions. The figure was there, its form massive and imposing, its hollow eyes glowing like twin flames. "This is my domain," it said, its voice echoing through the void. "You cannot defeat me here." I clenched my fists, refusing to let the fear take hold. "You're wrong," I said. "This place exists because of me. Without my fear, without my connection, you're nothing." The figure hesitated, its form flickering faintly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph I had taken from the attic, the one of my grandmother and the man with hollow eyes. "This is where it ends," I said, holding the photo up. "This is where I take back control." The figure roared, its form shifting and stretching as it lunged toward me. But I didn't run. I held my ground, focusing on the faces in the photograph, the people who had been trapped by the cycle for so long. The photo began to glow, its light cutting through the darkness. The figure recoiled, its hollow eyes flickering as it let out a distorted scream. "You cannot destroy me," it bellowed. "I am eternal." The light from the photo grew brighter, illuminating the void. The shadows around me dissolved, and the faces of the trapped souls became clearer, their expressions shifting from despair to hope. "You're not eternal," I said, my voice steady. "You're a parasite, and you fed on us for long enough." The figure's form began to crumble, its edges disintegrating into the light. The hum in my ears grew louder, reaching a crescendo as the void itself began to collapse. The last thing I heard before everything went white was the figure's final, desperate scream.